London, May 19th, 1536. Dawn breaks under a cold, gray sky at the Tower of London. A wooden scaffold stands ready in the courtyard, its freshly built platform lower than usual. Why lower? Because today, an executioner from France will swing a sword instead of an English axe. And his target isn't just anyone, it's the Queen of England. A crowd gathers in hushed anticipation. Whispers ripple through the chilly morning air. No one has ever seen a queen executed in England before, and they're about to witness history's dark new chapter. As they dress her, Anne even manages a grim little joke. She remarks that the executioner is very skilled and that her neck is so small. A morbid bit of humor that shows her courage in the face of the inevitable. How did it come to this? How did the second wife of Henry VIII, the woman for whom he tore apart his kingdom's religion, end up here waiting to die? To understand, we need to rewind a few years and see how Anne Boleyn's fairy tale rise turned into a nightmare. Anne's story began like that of many noble women, but she was anything but ordinary. She was born to Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious courtier, and Elizabeth Howard, a lady of one of England's noble families. As a teenager, Anne spent years in the glamorous French court, where she learned to speak elegantly, charm effortlessly, and think boldly. When Anne returned to England in 1522, she wasn't considered the classic beauty of her time. Her skin was olive-toned, her hair a striking black, and her dark eyes were full of fire. She didn't fit the era's fair-haired ideal, but Anne had something far more irresistible: charisma and a sharp, educated mind. People couldn't help but be drawn to her presence. One of those people was King Henry VIII. By the mid-1520s, Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was falling apart. Catherine hadn't given him the one thing he craved most: a healthy son to inherit his throne. When Henry first noticed Anne Boleyn at court, he was captivated. He had already had a romance with Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, but Anne was different. She refused to become just another mistress. Legend has it, Anne told Henry she would never be his concubine. If he wanted her love, he would have to make her his wife and his queen. It was a risky demand, but Henry was so smitten that he agreed to risk everything. And he did exactly that. For 7 long years, Henry pursued Anne with a single-minded obsession. The king moved heaven and earth to have her. He defied the Pope and ripped England away from the Catholic Church, just so he could divorce Catherine and marry Anne. Henry declared himself the supreme head of a new Church of England. He removed the authority of Rome from his realm, faced the wrath of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, and upended the lives of his subjects, all for Anne. By January 1533, Henry had secretly married Anne, who was already pregnant with the heir he so desperately wanted. In September of that year, Anne delivered her first child. But it wasn't the son Henry had gambled for. It was a daughter, the future Elizabeth I. Henry was disappointed, but Anne's influence as queen was just beginning. Anne Boleyn's reign as queen lasted only about 3 years, but she made every moment count. She was intelligent, outspoken, and not afraid to challenge tradition. Anne was a force at court. She championed religious reform and sponsored scholars and artists. She even helped get forbidden English language Bibles into circulation so ordinary people could read the scriptures. To those who supported her, Anne was a modernizing, courageous queen, but to her enemies, and there were many, she was a cunning schemer who had seduced the king and led him into heresy. From day one of her reign, Anne faced critics and rivals who quietly hoped to see her fall. Tragically for Anne, her downfall came from the very thing that had given her power: her ability to provide Henry with a male heir. After baby Elizabeth's birth, Anne became pregnant again, only to miscarry in 1534. Henry was anxious but stayed hopeful. Then, in early 1536, Anne miscarried a 3rd pregnancy, reportedly a male fetus. This was a crushing blow. For a king obsessed with having a son, Anne's failure to produce a male heir was unacceptable, however unfair that was to her. Henry's once passionate love for Anne cooled dramatically, and lurking in the shadows was another woman, Jane Seymour, a quiet lady-in-waiting who had already caught the king's eye. Henry's attentions were drifting toward Jane, even as Anne fought to keep his affection. Sensing the king's growing discontent, Anne's political enemies seized their chance. Chief among them was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's powerful advisor, and a former ally of Anne. By April 1536, Cromwell decided that Anne's time was up. He orchestrated a plot to bring down the Queen. Rumors and accusations began swirling around Anne. On May 2nd, 1536, she was arrested and hauled off to the Tower of London. The charges against her were as grave as they were absurd. Adultery with not one but 5 men, one of them her own brother, and an incestuous conspiracy to murder the king. In other words, treason of the highest order. Her trial was a sham. The court was packed with her enemies and those eager to please Henry. Witnesses later marveled at how eloquently Anne defended herself, answering every accusation with such wisdom and discretion that she even impressed some of the men who would come to condemn her. But it didn't matter. The outcome was predetermined. Anne was found guilty on all counts. The punishment for a queen convicted of treason was traditionally gruesome, burning at the stake. Henry, perhaps in a final twisted show of mercy, or perhaps to avoid a public horror show, decided to spare Anne that fate. Instead, he commuted her sentence to beheading. And not just any beheading, he summoned a specialist swordsman from Calais in France to do the job swiftly. This meant Anne would not die by the clumsy swing of an English axe, but by a swift, sharp sword. A quicker, cleaner death, at least in theory. It was an unusual choice that had people talking. Henry was going to great lengths to execute his own wife as swiftly and painlessly as possible. Which brings us back to this fateful day, May 19th, 1536. Anne woke up thinking that by 9 a.m., she would be gone from this world. She had prepared herself for the end, only to be told the execution was delayed until noon. Those extra hours must have been agonizing. Imagine counting down the minutes of your own life, only to have the clock cruelly extended at the last moment. Anne spent the time praying fervently. She took Holy Communion and repeatedly whispered pleas for God's mercy. She even swore on the sacred host that she had never betrayed the king, a final assertion of her innocence before God, if not before men. At midday, the heavy drum beats began to echo across the tower grounds, summoning all to the execution. Anne Boleyn stepped out of the fortress and into the pale daylight. She was greeted by a sea of faces. About 1,000 people had gathered, far fewer than expected for such a notorious event. An eerie hush fell over the crowd as Anne appeared on the scaffold in her somber gray mantle and blood-red bodice. Many in the crowd removed their caps in respect or disbelief. They saw not a conniving sorceress, as her enemies claimed, but a poised, sorrowful woman walking to her death with her head held high. On the scaffold, Anne was allowed to speak one final time. She surprised everyone with her composure. She did not beg for mercy, nor did she protest her innocence or lash out at those who condemned her. Instead, Anne calmly stated that she was dying according to the law and blamed no one for her fate. She even praised King Henry, calling him a gentle and merciful ruler, and asked the crowd to pray for him. Those words stunned many listeners. Here was Henry VIII, the husband who had cast her aside and ordered her death, being described by Anne as if he were the kindest of princes. Anne knew exactly what she was doing. By refusing to criticize the king or proclaim her innocence, she kept her dignity and perhaps protected her daughter Elizabeth's future. Even in her final moments, Anne Boleyn turned a cruel defeat into a display of loyalty and grace. After her brief speech, Anne knelt upright on the scaffold. One of her ladies stepped forward and tied a blindfold over Anne's eyes. Anne's lips moved in quiet prayer, softly pleading for Jesus to receive her soul and for God to have mercy on her. To spare Anne the horror of anticipation, the executioner resorted to a bit of deception. He suddenly called out, loudly asking for his sword as if it were missing, even though it was already in his hand. Anne instinctively turned her head toward the sound, not realizing the executioner had already positioned himself to strike. In that split second, he struck. In one lightning-quick move, the sword flashed through the morning air and sliced cleanly through Anne's neck. For a moment, the courtyard fell silent in shock. Anne's body collapsed onto the scaffold, blood quickly staining her dress and the wooden boards beneath her. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as they absorbed what had just happened. The executioner then lifted the queen's severed head by the hair and held it up high for all to see, proclaiming that this is how all the king's enemies would meet their end. But instead of a cheer, An uneasy murmur spread through the onlookers. There was no triumphant roar, only the hollow sound of dread at what they had witnessed. At that very moment, a series of thunderous booms rolled across the tower grounds. The cannons were firing from the walls, signaling to London and to King Henry, waiting anxiously at his Whitehall palace, that Anne Boleyn was dead. Henry, without wasting a second, moved on with his life. The next day, he became formally engaged to Jane Seymour, the lady who had already caught his eye. 10 days later, Henry and Jane were married. The ink was barely dry on Anne's death warrant, and she had already been replaced, as if she meant nothing at all. Back on Tower Green, Anne's weeping ladies gathered up her remains. In a final indignity, no coffin had been provided for the former Queen of England. The best they could find was an old wooden chest used for storing arrows. They placed Anne's head and body inside this makeshift coffin. That evening, Anne Boleyn's remains were carried to the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the tower walls. She was laid to rest beneath the stone floor in an unmarked grave, buried quietly without a tombstone, as if those in power wanted to pretend she had never been a queen at all. King Henry did everything he could to erase Anne from memory. He ordered her portraits destroyed, her emblems and symbols torn down from palaces, and her name scratched out from official records. This damnatio memoriae, a deliberate condemnation of memory, was so effective that to this day, historians have not found a single confirmed contemporary portrait of Anne Boleyn. Henry had tried to make the world forget the woman for whom he'd once changed the course of his entire kingdom. But Henry's attempt to obliterate Anne's legacy failed spectacularly, and the proof was their own child. That baby girl Anne bore him, Elizabeth, grew up to become one of England's greatest monarchs. Just 23 years after Anne's execution in 1558, Elizabeth Tudor ascended the throne as Queen Elizabeth I. She would reign for 45 years in an era that became known as the Golden Age of England. That daughter, once dismissed by Henry as a disappointment, ended up surpassing even her father's glory. Elizabeth brought the stability and prosperity that her father had so desperately sought, and she never forgot the lessons from her mother's tragic fate. In a twist of poetic justice, it was Anne Boleyn's blood that ultimately sat on the throne Henry so wanted to secure. Elizabeth I subtly honored her mother's memory throughout her life. She adopted Anne's emblem, the white falcon, as one of her own symbols, and she famously chose never to marry. The Virgin Queen, as Elizabeth became known, declared that she was married to England itself. Perhaps she understood that, in her world, marriage could be a deadly gamble, a lesson learned from her mother's story. Centuries later, Anne Boleyn's story still haunts the Tower of London. In 1876, workers renovating the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula discovered bones beneath the floor, in the spot where old records suggested Anne was buried. Among the remains, they found a delicate female skeleton with a small frame, consistent with Anne's build. These bones were respectfully reinterred, finally giving Anne a proper burial and a named resting place in the chapel. Today, on Tower Green, a simple glass monument marks the site of Anne's execution. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, admirers lay roses on that spot in her memory. Anne Boleyn has gone from being a condemned traitor in her own time to a figure of fascination and sympathy in ours. She's remembered not just as a tragic queen, but as a symbol of the injustice and danger that often hung over women who dared to wield power in a world ruled by men. In the end, Anne's story is as dramatic as it gets: a meteoric rise, a catastrophic fall, and an unexpected triumph through her daughter. The gray morning of May 19, 1536, saw Anne Boleyn walk to her death with courage and dignity. But it was not the end of her influence. Her life and death set in motion changes that would shape the future of England. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more dark and dramatic tales from history. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious.